Lucifer, the fall of light. Before the fear, before the imagery people associate with darkness, there was a name that sounded almost beautiful. Lucifer. A word that doesn't begin in chaos, it begins in light. Because in its original sense, it carries the idea of something like morning brightness, a light bearer, something radiant, elevated, almost majestic in description. And that's where the tension begins, because the name itself feels out of place in the story people later attach to it. This is not a name born in destruction, it is a name tied to a fall, a shift, a collapse from what something was into what it became. And that's the first key to understanding this figure in scripture. Not starting as darkness, but becoming it. There is a description in ancient prophetic language that paints a picture of a being positioned in height, symbolically close to perfection, closeness, authority, beauty. Not random existence, but placement. And with placement comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes choice. Because nothing described in that original state suggests chaos. It suggests order until something shifts inward. The text doesn't describe an external attack, it describes an intentional movement. Something like elevation turning into desire, position turning into self-exaltation. And that shift, small in language but massive in consequence, is where the identity begins to fracture. Because at some point, the question stops being, who am I positioned under? And it becomes, why am I not higher? That change in perspective is subtle, but it is enough to alter direction entirely. And this is where the fall is described, not as a physical descent, but as a loss of alignment. A being once described in terms of brightness, now moving away from its source. And anything that moves away from light, being God, does not need darkness to become dark. It only needs separation. Because in that separation, identity starts to distort. What was once reflective becomes self-centered. What was once dependent becomes independent. What was once positioned under authority begins to resist authority. And that resistance is where the collapse takes shape. Now, pause there, because this is not just about a figure in ancient texts. This is a pattern of elevation without grounding, capacity without alignment, position without surrender. And the danger in that kind of shift is that it often doesn't feel like a fall at first. It feels like progress, like expansion, like becoming more, until the direction reveals itself. Because movement away from source always feels like freedom at the beginning, but it slowly becomes isolation. That is the arc embedded in the name Lucifer, as it is later understood in theological reflection. Not just a name of darkness, but a name of what happens when something refuses its place and begins to define itself apart from it. And that's why the name carries a lot of weight. Not because it represents fear, but because it represents a warning that even something described as bright can become something entirely different when it loses alignment with what gave it light in the first place. So when this name is broken in later texts and interpretations, it is no longer about beauty. It is about a story of transition, from reflected light to rejected order, from position to separation, from identity received to identity redefined. And that is where the narrative begins, not with horror, but with a question that echoes underneath it all. What happens when something stops receiving light and tries to become its own source? That is the foundation, and everything else that follows builds from here. Satan, the accuser. Now the tone shifts because this name doesn't carry the same imagery of light or fall. It carries something colder, more direct. Satan. And in its original sense, it is not first presented as a name of chaos, but as a role, an accuser, someone who brings charges, someone who stands in opposition, not with noise, but with argument. In the language behind the text, this idea is rooted in the concept of legal confrontation, a courtroom setting, not a battlefield. And that detail changes everything because now the image is not just of destruction but of prosecution. A figure standing in opposition, presenting claims, questioning motives, challenging integrity, not random accusation. And this is where the deeper layer begins to form because accusation always needs a foundation. It does not create evidence, it searches for it. It looks for weakness, inconsistency, gaps between what is seen and what is claimed. And that is why this role is so important in the narrative structure. It represents the pressure that exposes what is hidden beneath appearance. Because in most lives, everything looks stable on the outside until pressure reveals what was already there underneath. And in that sense, the accuser does not invent failure, it tests what can hold. Now, step into the imagery used in ancient scenes. This figure appears in a courtroom, standing before God, pointing toward human weakness, not acting as a judge, but as a prosecutor. And that distinction matters because a judge declares verdict, a prosecutor presents accusation, which means this role is not ultimate authority, but permitted confrontation. And that introduces tension into the story. Because if accusation is allowed to stand in this space, then it suggests something deeper is being examined. Not just behavior, but authenticity. Is this real? Is this genuine? Is there substance beneath appearance? That is the underlying question behind this role. And that is why it appears in moments where human confidence is at its strongest. Because accusation thrives where certainty is untested. And when pressure enters the scene, what seems strong begins to reveal whether it actually is. But there is something else to notice. The role does not only point outward, it also echoes inward. Because accusation is not always external, it becomes internal. It begins to sound like thoughts, questions, replays of failures, interpretation of mistakes. You are not enough. You missed it. You failed again. And over time, that voice stops feeling external. It starts feeling like the truth. And that is the deeper danger embedded in the concept. Not just accusation spoken, but accusation believed. So when this name appears in scripture, it is not simply describing a being, it is describing a function, a pressure point in reality where identity is challenged through accusation. And every time that pressure appears, the same question is being tested again. What stands when your confidence is questioned? What remains when your justification is challenged? What holds when your image is stripped down? Because that is what accusation is designed to reveal. Not just failure, but foundation. And that is why this name carries weight. Not because it speaks of power, but because it exposes vulnerability. And what survives that exposure is what was real all along. Next, we move deeper into the third name, where deception becomes the focus. The serpent, deception in disguise. Now, the language changes again, but this time, it doesn't sound like authority. It sounds subtle, almost ordinary. The serpent, a form that doesn't announce itself with force. It enters quietly, and that detail is what makes it dangerous. Because unlike accusation, which confronts, this one convinces. It doesn't stand in a courtroom, it enters a conversation, a moment, a thought you didn't fully question. In the earliest scene where the image appears, there is no loud introduction, no warning, just dialogue. And that is the point. Because deception rarely arrives as contradiction, it arrives as adjustment, a slight shift in interpretation, a reframe of what was already said, something familiar but slightly twisted. And that's how perception begins to bend, not through obvious lies, but through believable ones. The kind that feel reasonable at the moment they are heard. Now, here's what makes this image deeper than just symbolism. The serpent doesn't force action, it introduces possibility. What if? Did God really mean? Maybe it's not what you think. And once possibility enters the mind, certainty begins to weaken. Because certainty requires trust, and deception doesn't attack trust directly. It erodes it slowly through questions that feel harmless at first. But they are not harmless, they are seeds. And seeds don't reveal their outcome immediately. They grow silently until what was once clear becomes complicated. Now, notice the pattern. Accusation challenges identity from the outside, but deception reshapes perception from the inside. One confronts you, the other redefines how you see. And that is why the imagery of a serpent is used in reflective interpretation, because it moves close to the ground, close to awareness, close enough to go unnoticed until it has already spoken. And once it speaks, the mind begins to do the rest, replaying, reinterpreting, rebuilding meaning around doubt. And this is where the real shifts happens, because the goal is not immediate destruction, it is altered perception. A world where truth is no longer stable but negotiable. And once truth becomes negotiable, direction becomes unstable. Because you cannot walk firmly in what you no longer trust completely. That is the deeper layer behind this name. Not just deception as an act, but deception as a process. A slow change in how reality is being interpreted. And the most dangerous part of this is that it feels like thinking, like reasoning, like awareness. But underneath it, it is distortion taking shape. So, the serpent is not just a figure in a story, it becomes a pattern of influence, one that doesn't shout but suggests. And suggestion, repeated long enough, starts to feel like truth. That is why this name matters, because it shows that not every collapse begins with force. Some begin with conversation, and what you agree with internally eventually shapes what you live externally. Next, we move into the fourth name, where darkness becomes the theme and influence turns systemic. 4. The ruler of this world, power over systems. Now, the tone shifts again, but this time it's not personal, it is structural. The ruler of this world. This name doesn't point to a creature in isolation. It points to influence that spreads through systems, through environments people live inside without questioning. Because this is not about a single moment of deception or accusation. This is about governing influence within a broken order. And the language used here is not about ownership in the absolute sense, but about control, through alignment. It describes a world where values, desires, and direction can be shaped from within the system itself, not by force, but by consistency. Because systems don't need to shout to influence you, they only need to define what is normal. And once normal is accepted, resistance becomes rare. Now, think about how this works. A system doesn't need to convince you every day, it only needs to set patterns: what success looks like, what value means, what direction life should take. And over time, people begin to move inside those patterns without even noticing they were formed. That is the deeper idea behind this title. Not chaos, but structured influence. And this is why it feels different from the previous names. The serpent walks through suggestion, the accuser walks through confrontation, but this role walks through environment, through what surrounds you until it starts shaping how you feel and what you think is possible. And when something defines what feels possible, it also defines what feels impossible. Now, bring that closer, because this is not just ancient imagery, it reflects how pressure operates in everyday life. Systems that reward certain behaviors, systems that punish others, systems that slowly teach people what to pursue and what to ignore. And without realizing it, people begin to adapt, not because they consciously agree, but because they are immersed. And immersion always reshapes thinking over time. That's why this name carries a lot of weight, because it is not describing isolated temptation, it is describing contextual influence, the environment where decisions are formed before decisions are even made. Now, here's the tension, because systems feel normal when you are inside them. You don't question the air you breathe. You don't analyze the ground you walk on. You just live. But once awareness enters, you start to see that not everything around you was neutral. Some things were shaping direction quietly, and that realization can be unsettling because it means not all choices feel like choices. Some feel like outcomes of what has already been built around you. And that is where the name lands, not as a figure in isolation, but as a description of influence that operates through structure, repetition, and acceptance. So the real question becomes, what has shaped what you call normal? Because whatever defines normal quietly defines direction. And that is the hidden power behind systems. Not control through force, but control through familiarity. Next, we move into the final name, where all of this converges into opposition itself. The adversary, the final opposition. Now, everything comes together: the names, the patterns, the roles, and at the center of it all, one final description: the adversary. This is not just accusation, not just deception, not just influence through systems. This is opposition itself, standing against, resisting direction, contesting movement, but not in a chaotic way, in a structured one. Because adversary is not simply someone who hates, it is someone who opposes position, which means the focus is not emotion, it is alignment. Now think carefully. Opposition only matters when something is moving in a direction. No movement, no resistance, no purpose, no conflict. So the presence of an adversary implies something deeper is already in motion, something being formed, directed, established. An opposition emerges against it. That is why this final name is not random, it is relational. It only makes sense in contrast to something else. Now, step into the weight of it, because in this framing, life is not neutral ground. It is a place of direction, and anything moving toward purpose will naturally encounter resistance. Not always obvious, not always external, sometimes subtle, sometimes internal, but resistance nonetheless. And this is where all the previous names converge. Accusation challenges identity, deception reshapes perception, systems influence environment, but opposition itself is the umbrella over all of it. It is the pressure that tests what remains when everything else is applied. Now bring it closer, because this is where understanding shifts from theory to reflection. If opposition exists in this form, then not everything that resists you is random, and not everything that feels difficult is meaningless. Some resistance reveals direction, but its purpose within the larger narrative is not just destruction, it is confrontation of movement. Because nothing stationary is truly tested, only what moves forward is challenged. So the question becomes different now. Not why is there resistance, but what is being revealed through it. Because opposition has a way of exposing what comfort never will: your stability, your foundation, your consistency, and sometimes even your assumptions about what direction you are actually on. That is why this final name matters. It gathers everything before it into one idea, not random chaos, but structured resistance against purpose. And once you see it that way, you stop interpreting everything as isolated events. You start seeing patterns, and patterns change awareness, because now what you thought was just pressure might actually be revealing something deeper about your direction. So all five names tell a story, not just of identity, but of function, a movement from light to accusation, to deception, to influence, to opposition, and each layer adds depth to the same question: what happens when purpose is confronted from every angle? And that's where understanding stops being just information and start becoming awareness. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it.